Welcome to PandaAudioBooks, the perfect place for a huge collection of fantasy novels. If you enjoy my content and want to support my work, a small contribution via PayPal is greatly appreciated. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell to stay updated with our latest audiobook chapters. Chapter 1205, Battle at the Star Palace, 2. Chapter 1206, Battle at the Star Palace, 2. You're more likely not aware of this, Xianxia, but coalition leader Wan had set up 108 windfire copper pillars, then gathered a few powerful formation spellmasters to set up a heavenly windfire formation around the island that Heavenly Star City is situated on, and is using the boundless powers of fire and wind to attack the Star Palace. As long as the coalition's cultivators can guard the 108 windfire pillars, that'll be enough to trap the entirety of Heavenly Star City. The hook-nosed man knew that he would be punished by the coalition for revealing this information, but the cold glare that Han Li had directed at him had tipped him over the edge, and in his horror, he blurted out this information without thinking. As soon as those words escaped from his mouth, the hook-nosed man was sorely regretting his decision. However, even a core formation cultivator like him was aware of this information, so it clearly wasn't very confidential. With that in mind, he was feeling slightly more relieved. A heavenly windfire formation. Han Li stirred slightly upon hearing this. He hadn't ever studied this formation in detail, but many of the formation spell tomes that he had read had mentioned this formation on quite a number of occasions. It was said that in ancient times, there was a restriction formation that could draw upon the powers of fire and wind within this world, and the staggering enormity of this formation was vastly renowned. If the Starfall Coalition had managed to set up such a formation, then there really was a possibility that they could have used it to surround Heavenly Star City. After all, with Wan Qianming guarding the formation core in person, even if the Star Palace cultivators managed to destroy a few windfire pillars, those pillars could be easily repaired. As long as the formation core remained intact, there was no way to truly destroy the formation. A contemplative look appeared on Han Li's face. Meanwhile, tension was rolling off the bodies of the Starfall Coalition cultivators in almost palpable waves. It didn't take a genius to be able to tell that Han Li was here to reinforce the Star Palace, so they were in a very perilous situation. In contrast, the three White Water Sword sect cultivators ensnared with the azure net were ecstatic. The elderly man hurriedly yelled, "Xianxia, we've come here to reinforce the Star Palace, and those people are all cultivators from the Starfall Coalition's Enforcement Division. They've killed countless cultivators who have pledged their allegiance to the Star Palace, and they deserve to die countless deaths for their crimes. Don't let these people live, Xianxia." All of the Starfall Coalition cultivators' faces paled upon hearing this. The two cultivators who were standing the farthest away from Han Li glanced at one another before flipping over their hands in unison, producing a small yellow flag each. They then immediately tossed those flags into the air, upon which they transformed into two yellow clouds that enshrouded the bodies of the two cultivators. Within the blink of an eye, the two yellow clouds had completely vanished. In the next instant, the yellow clouds appeared over 200 feet away before quickly disappearing again. Teleportation. Han Li's pupils contracted minutely as a hint of surprise appeared on his face. However, a cold chuckle then escaped his mouth as he abruptly raised a hand, feigning a grabbing motion toward the azure net that had ensnared the three White Water Sword sect cultivators. The two Starfall Coalition cultivators controlling the net felt as if a resounding boom had rung out directly in their heads, and they were struck by an intense spell of dizziness. They lost control of the all-encompassing net as a result, and it reverted back into a ball of azure light, allowing the three ensnared cultivators to escape while the net landed in Han Li's hand. Han Li paid no heed to the words of gratitude extended toward him by the three rescued cultivators as white and azure light flashed behind him, materializing a pair of wings on his back. The wings flapped gently, and Han Li disappeared amid a gust of wind. It was quite clear that he had set off in pursuit of the two cultivators who had just teleported away. The remaining Starfall Coalition cultivators were both shocked and elated to see this, and they all glanced at one another before fleeing in different directions. Han Li was an extremely fearsome enemy, so they were certainly not going to take a gamble with their lives and hoped that Han Li would spare them out of the kindness in his heart. However, the 3 white water sword sect cultivators were naturally unwilling to allow their enemies get away. As such, all 3 of them let loose enraged roars as they also set off in pursuit of the Starfall Coalition cultivators. In the distance, 2 muffled thumps erupted in mid-air. Immediately thereafter, white light flashed, and 2 yellow clouds shot back as if they had been struck by some kind of immense force. A gentle breeze blew past, and Han Li appeared out of thin air, appraising the 2 yellow clouds nearby with a cold deriding sneer on his lips. A third inky black eye had appeared over his glabella, and it disappeared again following a flash of black light. The 2 Starfall Coalition cultivators within the yellow clouds were revealed again with blood-stained robes and extremely pale faces. They both appeared to have been severely wounded, and were in a state of shock and horror. Ever since they had obtained these 2 yellow sand Buddhist flags, they had managed to use them to escape from nascent soul cultivators on several occasions. As such, they were extremely confident in the ability of this pair of treasures. Otherwise, they wouldn't have dared to flee the scene even after witnessing Han Li's fearsome might. However, Han Li had merely thrown 2 nonchalant punches through the air, and their confidence had been completely shattered. Only then did they realize that this young man was even more fearsome than they had anticipated. Even so, the 2 of them certainly weren't going to give up and allow themselves to be killed. Thus, they immediately gritted their teeth and let loose loud cries in unison as they blasted mouthfuls of blood essence into the yellow clouds. The clouds immediately tumbled and surged before turning into a crimson color. The 2 cultivators then began to join their voices in a chant, clearly preparing to unleash their final trump card. A cold light immediately appeared in Han Li's eyes as he abruptly opened his mouth. 2 piercing streaks of yellow light shot forth from within, appearing in front of the crimson clouds in the blink of an eye before instantly puncturing them. 2 anguished cries rang out from within the crimson clouds before the 2 cultivators plummeted toward the sea down below. Right at this moment, Han Li pointed a finger at them expressionlessly. The 2 small golden swords emerged from thin air again before revolving around the 2 Starfall Coalition cultivators. Balls of golden light erupted, instantly enshrouding the 2 cultivators within, following a vast expanse of blood began to rain down from above. Han Li didn't even afford the 2 a chance to unleash their secret technique before putting an end to their lives. Only then did he wave his hand toward the 2 crimson clouds. The crimson light on those clouds quickly receded, and they reverted back into yellow clouds before flying toward him. Han Li cast 2 incantation seals, both of which disappeared into the clouds. As the yellow clouds approached him, they transformed into 2 yellow flags again before being stowed away up his sleeve. These 2 ancient treasures were quite useful for fleeing from perilous situations. Of course, they served no purpose for him, but they would be extremely valuable for his disciples. After stowing away his 2 flying swords, Han Li turned his attention toward the rest of the fleeing Starfall Coalition cultivators in a calm and collected manner. During this brief delay, all of them had fled to over 1,000 feet away, and the fast cultivator among them had already become a black dot in the distance. Han Li heaved a faint sigh before grabbing onto a spirit beast pouch hanging from his waist and tossing it into the air. A loud burst of buzzing rang out as a swarm of golden beetles emerged from within. The beetles split up into 5 smaller swarms at Han Li's behest before hurtling toward different directions as fast as lightning. Meanwhile, Han Li flipped his palm over and the 2 yellow flags appeared again for his inspection. The swarms of golden beetles and the fleeing cultivators disappeared into the distance in the blink of an eye. Not long after that, golden light flashed in the distance again as the swarms of beetles flew back from different directions one after the other. The 3 white water sword sect also flew toward Han Li behind the swarms of beetles, but they were looking at the swarms with horrified and traumatized expressions. It appeared that the 3 of them had just witnessed the gold-devouring beetles devouring living people, and had been greatly shaken by that gruesome visual experience. After Han Li stowed away the beetles into his spirit beast pouch again, the elderly man stepped forward in a respectful manner, and said, "Thank you for saving our lives, Senior. If it weren't for your intervention, the 3 of us would most likely be dead by now." "There's no need to thank me. I only saved the 3 of you because I just so happened to be passing by anyway. Now that Heavenly Star City has been surrounded, the 3 of you won't even be able to access the island at your cultivations bases. You should hurry up and go back. I have no interest in carrying useless baggage while I try to break through that heavenly windfire formation," Han Li replied in an aloof voice. The three cultivators knew that Han Li was right, and wry smiles appeared on their faces. As such, after extending some further words of gratitude to Han Li, the three of them returned the way they had come. Han Li looked on with narrowed eyes for a while as the three cultivators departed before flying toward Heavenly Star City. A journey of several tens of thousands of feet was naturally not a very lengthy one for Han Li. Along the way, he noticed several groups of Starfall Coalition cultivators hidden beneath large rocks or under the surface of the ocean. Even though none of them as powerful as the first group he had encountered, which had 7 or 8 core formation cultivators among their ranks, there were still 2 or 3 high-grade cultivators in each group. These people were clearly stationed here to take care of anyone who managed to escape from the Heavenly Star City. Han Li couldn't be bothered to pay any heed to these cultivators. He simply transformed into a faint azure shadow and glided soundlessly through the air above them. None of these Starfall Coalition cultivators were alerted to the fact that they had just brushed shoulders with death. When Han Li was only just over 50 kilometers away from Heavenly Star City, he finally saw some flashes of red light in the distance. After drawing even closer, he discovered that the entire island had been completely enshrouded under a veil-like layer of azure and red light. Furthermore, he could hear the sound of indistinct rumbling akin to thunderclaps coming from the direction of the island. Han Li raised his eyebrows upon making these observations, and he quickly made a series of hand seals, following which the barely visible streak of azure light he had transformed into was completely concealed. At the same time, Han Li decelerated significantly, approaching the island at a much more leisurely pace. After flying for several tens of kilometers, the situation around Heavenly Star City was finally completely revealed to Han Li. There were countless black spots visible on the surface of the ocean in the extremely far distance. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that these were spirit boats of all types of different styles and models. Some of them were as tall as pavilions with intricate carvings running along their hulls, while some were only around 20 feet in length with very crude and simple designs. There was also great diversity in the materials that these boats were constructed from, including light green spiritual wood, pristine and flawless jade, and even some completely pitch-black iron boats that glistened under the sunlight. Chapter 1206, Battle at the Star Palace, 2. These spirit boats were all positioned around 3 gargantuan pillars that extended over 1,000 feet up into the sky. Each pillar was entirely yellow in color with azure and red light rippling like water over their surfaces. These streams of azure and red light were pouring upward relentlessly, and they were clearly responsible for maintaining the veil of light enshrouding the entire island. Han Li knew that these massive pillars were most definitely the legendary Windfire pillars, and the Starfall Coalition cultivators in those spirit boats down below had clearly been deployed here to guard the pillars. From a rough visual estimation, Han Li determined that there were about 2,000 to 3,000 cultivators down below. In order to avoid raising the alarm, he refrained from using his spiritual sense to ascertain their numbers. However, he was certain that there were definitely nascent soul cultivators among their ranks. As for whether the sect master of the myriad gates of enlightenment was also there, that was something that only the heavens knew. However, there were a total of 108 Windfire pillar, so surely he couldn't just happen to be situated near one of these 3, right? If this sect master WN really were in the general vicinity and tried to stop him, Han Li didn't know whether that would count as bad luck for him or for WN Qianming. The Heavenly Windfire formation was an extremely renowned and powerful formation, but according to Han Li's knowledge, this massive formation had been invented with the purpose of attacking large sects in mind. As such, it was extremely effective against large numbers of normal mid-grade and low-grade cultivators, but it wasn't particularly effective in the face of individual high-grade cultivators. At his current power level, it would only be slightly troublesome at most for him to bypass this formation, and there was no way that it would actually be able to trap him. Han Li stood in mid-air and hesitated for a long while. He then cast his gaze toward a certain direction in the distance, turning his attention away from the spirit boats and 3 pillars directly before him, and flying toward the veil of azure and red light instead. At this moment, there was a 3-story ship floating on the surface of the ocean at the foot of one of the pillars. The ship was extremely large and had been entirely crafted from beautiful green jade, thereby creating a spectacle of mesmerizing beauty to behold. In the highest level of the ship, there were several cultivators seated around a square jade table, chatting about something with smiles on their faces. There were a few plates of rare spirit fruits placed on the jade table, and all of the cultivators seated around the table appeared to be quite carefree and relaxed. A white-robed scholar at the table turned to the elderly man sitting across from him, and he smiled as he asked, "Senior Long, I heard that if we can conquer the Star Palace this time, Coalition Leader WN would agree to hand over one of the 3 spirit islands of the Myriad Gates of Enlightenment, the Heavenly Fortune Island, to your Golden Lotus sect. Is that true?" The elderly man glared at the scholar out of the corners of his eyes, and replied, "You sure are quite well informed, Nephew Ning. Fellow Daoist WAN did indeed make that promise to me. The spirit vein on the Heavenly Fortune Island is superior to the one on the island I'm currently residing on, so relocating there will be very beneficial for our sect's future development." A grey-robed middle-aged Daoist priest chuckled. "Indeed, the Heavenly Fortune Island is quite renowned throughout the entire scattered star seas for the quality of its spirit vein. On top of that, the island produces many types of rare spirit herbs as well, so it'll only be a matter of time for your Golden Lotus sect to rise to another level following the relocation. Speak for yourself, fellow Daoist Hua. Weren't you also given a dozen or so types of rare materials? Otherwise, why would an old reclusive monster like you decide to come out and offer Brother WN your assistance?" The elderly man replied with a nonchalant smile. Among the 3 people on the top level of the ship, 2 were early nascent soul cultivators. The white-robed scholar was only a late-core formation cultivator, but he was speaking to the other 2 in a manner that was neither haughty nor humble, so it was quite clear that he was not just some ordinary late-core formation cultivator, either. The middle-aged man smiled upon hearing this, and was just about to say something again, when a low ringing sound rang out from the wind-fire pillar closest to them. The red and azure light that it was releasing also began to tremor violently, as if it were being struck by an invisible force. "Someone's trying to break through the formation," the Daoist priest exclaimed as he immediately rose to his feet. The elderly man and the scholar also stirred slightly as they also stood up and turned their attention toward the massive pillar. The Daoist priest summoned a formation plate and made a hand seal before quickly pointing his finger several times in quick succession. "The attack is coming from the southwestern direction. Wait a minute, it's someone trying to come in rather than get out. Those guards are so useless." Azure light flashed around the elderly man's body, following which an azure carriage suddenly appeared. A sinister smile appeared on his face as he said, "Let's go, fellow Daoist Hua." Seeing as the invader was able to bypass the guards and dares to try and break through the heavenly windfire formation, they're definitely no ordinary person. This place isn't very far away from where the attack is taking place, and with the power of the windfire formation standing in his way, there's no way that he'll be able to immediately gain access to Heavenly Star City. "I'll be in your care, then, Brother Long." The middle-aged Daoist priest immediately strode into the carriage without any hesitation. The elderly man cast an incantation seal onto the carriage, and its entire structure was immediately enshrouded under a ball of azure light. The carriage shuddered before disappearing in the veil of red and azure light nearby, as if it had truly merged as one with the formation. The jade carriage was flashing through the red and azure light at an astonishing speed without any impediment, and the middle-aged Daoist priest standing in the carriage stroked his beard as he praised, "Amazing. I've heard many great things about your heavenly wind carriage, but I didn't think it would attain such an incredible ability here in this windfire formation. Tsk, it seems that Brother WN must have been aware of your carriage's ability, which is why he organized for you to guard such an important location." Perhaps that's indeed the case. Although ever since fellow Daoist WN progressed to the late nascent soul stage, his thoughts and intentions have become more and more unpredictable to the likes of you and me, the elderly man replied with a nonchalant smile. The middle-aged Daoist priest smiled upon hearing this, but gave no reply. The heavenly wind carriage beneath their feet was traveling far faster than even a normal mid-nascent soul cultivator was capable of, and under the guidance of the tracking formation plate in the elderly man's hand, they had traveled several tens of kilometers in what seemed like just a few moments. "Take care now. That person is just up ahead. They seem to have broken through most of the formation already and are about to completely escape from the powers of fire and wind, so they must be quite powerful." The elderly man stared at the formation plate in his hand, and a grave expression appeared on his face for the very first time. Before the Daoist priest had a chance to respond, he immediately made a hand seal and began to chant something. Brilliant azure spiritual light erupted from the jade carriage, making the entire carriage and its passengers blurry and indistinct. In the blink of an eye, they had completely disappeared into the veil of red and azure light. The elderly man had unleashed a secret technique to conceal himself and the Daoist priest. As such, they would be able to survey the situation from the shadows before deciding whether they should attack or retreat. The middle-aged Daoist priest nodded in approval at this course of action. The two of them refrained from using their spiritual sense as the jade carriage rose into the air, decelerating significantly in the process. After flying for a few more kilometers, the two of them finally caught sight of the person attempting to break through the formation in the distance, upon which expressions of surprise appeared on both of their faces. The cultivator attacking the formation appeared to be absurdly young. He seemed to be a young man in his 20s. Furthermore, he hadn't summoned any treasures and had only manifested a layer of protective azure light around his body. Despite that, he was able to fly through the red and azure light at a consistent pace, and the process seemed as easy to him as if he were taking a stroll in the park. Who is that? Could it be that he's a mid-nascent soul cultivator? The elderly man exclaimed. If any other high-grade cultivators from the Starfall Coalition had been in the same position as these two, they would have immediately been able to identify Han Li. Due to the incident surrounding the Heaven Void Cauldron, Han Li's portrait had been spread all over the scattered star seas. Even though so many years had passed, all cultivators had astonishing memories, so there was no way that they would have failed to recognize him. However, unfortunately for these two, they were nascent soul cultivators whom Wan Qianming had recruited from outside the Starfall Coalition. Even though the respective sects they belonged to were also quite powerful, they were almost constantly in seclusion, so they knew very little about what was happening in the scattered star seas. If it weren't for the fact that Wan Qianming had offered them extremely lucrative remunerations, they most likely would have declined to participate in this battle. As such, the two of them were completely unfamiliar with Han Li, and were quite bewildered as a result. Even so, the elderly man and the Daoist priest weren't actually fearful toward Han Li. If they were to join forces, they would be able to put up a fight even against a mid-nascent soul cultivator. Furthermore, their enemy may not even be a mid-nascent soul cultivator. No matter how little they kept up with current affairs, they were still aware of all of the old monsters on the scattered star seas who were at the mid-nascent soul stage above. As such, rather deciding to retreat, the elderly man continued to approach Han Li, confident in his jade carriage's ability to shield them from Han Li's detection. When the two of them soundlessly reached a spot in the air around 300 feet above Han Li, the two cultivators carefully appraised him again. They discovered that Han Li had a set of mundane facial features and was wearing a nondescript azure robe. Aside from the storage pouches and spirit beast pouches hanging from his waist, there was nothing about him that caught their eyes, and it was impossible to determine his origins. The elderly man's brows furrowed as he turned toward the middle-aged Daoist priest with an inquisitive look. The Daoist priest only hesitated momentarily before slowly nodding his head. Thus, the two of them laid their hands on their respective storage pouches at the same time, taking a deep breath in unison as they prepared to unleash a devastating surprise attack. However, right at this moment, Han Li suddenly raised his head and smiled up at them. A pair of white and azure wings appeared on his back, and he abruptly disappeared following a gentle flap of those wings. The two cultivators were extremely alarmed by this sight. They were able to reach the nascent soul stage, so they naturally weren't ordinary cultivators, and the elderly man immediately decided to abort the attempt to unleash a surprise attack as he hurriedly stomped down upon the jade carriage underfoot, pouring his magic power into the carriage in a panicked frenzy. The carriage's concealment technique was immediately dispelled, while a ball of piercing azure light appeared, enshrouding both cultivators as well as the carriage. Meanwhile, the middle-aged Daoist priest hurriedly pulled out a black and white yin-yang mirror from his storage pouch before tossing it into the air. Chapter 1207. Battle at the Star Palace, 3. Almost at the exact same moment, an azure arc of lightning flashed in the air above the jade carriage, upon which Han Li appeared out of thin air before immediately sweeping a sleeve through the air. Several tens of small golden swords shot forth from within, transforming into streaks of golden light that rained down from above. "Break!" the middle-aged Daoist priest yelled as his expression changed drastically. As he did so, he pointed a finger toward the yin-yang mirror overhead. A pillar of black and white immediately shot forth from the surface of the mirror before transforming into clumps of thin threads that attempted to ensnare the golden streaks of light. A string of resounding booms erupted as threads and the golden light clashed, and the black and white threads were severed with ease as if they were delicate strands of silk. The Daoist priest's heart jolted with shock, and before he had a chance to react, the flying sword had already struck the azure ball of light around the carriage. The same thing happened again. The azure light was only able to withstand these streaks of golden light for a brief moment before being completely punctured, and the golden light continued onward, having barely been slowed down at all by the obstacles thrown at them. The elderly man and the Daoist priest were truly petrified now. The two of them rose into the air at the same time, abandoning the jade carriage beneath their feet as they fled through the air in different directions. One was an azure streak of light and the other as a white streak of light. In the blink of an eye, they were already over 100 feet away and had just barely managed to evade the small golden swords. As the middle-aged Daoist priest hurtled into the distance, he patted one of the spirit beast pouches hanging from his waist, and a clear cry erupted from within as a snowy white bird around a foot in size emerged. The bird had a pair of green eyes, a sharp crimson beak, and a pair of black talons. The Daoist priest was feeling greatly reassured after summoning this bird, and he reached into his sleeve before producing a crimson badge. There was red light shimmering over the badge, and a dense bunch of runes could also be seen on its surface. Before he had a chance to activate this badge, spatial fluctuations proliferated forth from the air above him, following which Han Li emerged from an arc of azure lightning. He turned his gaze toward the Daoist priest down below and harumphed coldly as brilliant blue eyes radiated from his eyes. The Daoist priest was naturally greatly alarmed and immediately tried to activate the treasure in his hand. However, he suddenly felt as if his spiritual sense had been viciously pricked by a sharp object, and he was suddenly afflicted by a splitting headache. A cry of pain immediately escaped his mouth as blood began to trickle out from his ears and nostrils, and he almost dropped the badge in his hand in his agony. Han Li took advantage of this opportunity to flick his 5 fingers in quick succession, sending 5 red threads flashing through the air. Meanwhile, green light flashed in his other hand and a green wooden ruler emerged, which he gently waved it toward the snowy white bird. Crimson flames hurtled through the air, and threads punctured the middle-aged Daoist priest's body. The threads then wound themselves around him, transforming into 5 thick fiery ropes that rendered him completely immobile. Only then did the Daoist priest return to his senses in the aftermath of his excruciating headache, and his face immediately turned deathly pale as he realized the desperate situation that he was in. He was completely unable to move, and he hurriedly summoned his spirit bird to come and rescue him using his spiritual sense, but it completely ignored his orders. The Daoist priest was feeling extremely alarmed as he turned his attention toward the spirit bird, only to find that a silver lotus flower had appeared above its head. 7-colored Buddhist light was emanating from the lotus flower, enshrouding the spirit bird's entire body and completely immobilizing it as well. A wave of shock and fury surged through the Daoist priest's heart, and before he had a chance to think out of this dire situation, a gentle breeze swept over his head, and a streak of golden light came crashing down like lightning from above. The Daoist priest could only cry out in despair before he was decapitated by the golden light. Han Li's body reappeared amid the gust of wind, and he immediately raised both hands into the air at the same time. Loud thunderclaps rang out as a vast expanse of golden lightning arcs shot forth, interweaving with one another to form a golden net. The entire net was shimmering with golden light and creating a raucous commotion as it ensnared the Daoist priest's headless body. Han Li then began to chant something, and scorching flames suddenly erupted from the ropes binding the Daoist priest's body. Bursts of crimson flames shot forth immediately thereafter, instantly reducing the body to a pile of ashes. However, almost at the exact same moment, the Daoist priest's nascent soul emerged from the flames within a ball of white light. It was holding a white scepter in its hands, and was desperately attempting to flee into the distance. However, it crashed headfirst into the golden lightning net, upon which it was rebounded amid a string of rumbling thunderclaps. Brilliant golden light then radiated forth as the golden net exploded violently, and the nascent soul was instantly reduced to nothingness amid the devastating explosion. Only then did Han Li exhale gently as he turned toward another direction with a cold light in his eyes. At this moment, the elderly man had already fled to over 400 feet away, and he had pulled out a pair of azure bowls from a storage pouch hanging from his waist. He hadn't even made up his mind about whether he wanted to attack Han Li yet, and the Daoist priest was already dead. The elderly man's heart immediately sank upon seeing this, and he felt as if his entire body had been plunged into a glacial pit. As Han Li swept his gaze toward the elderly man, the latter suddenly raised an arm, and a burst of azure light flashed as he used the sharp edge of one of his bowls to dismember one of his own arms. The amputated arm exploded amid a loud thump, and the resulting blood mist enshrouded the elderly man's entire body as a blood-curdling shriek rang out. The blood around the elderly man's body transformed him into a faint crimson shadow, which hurtled rapidly into the distance. Following just a few flashes, the crimson shadow had already covered a distance of over 1,000 feet, and the speed of its movement was rather astonishing, even to Han Li. Han Li's eyes narrowed and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. During that split-second delay, the crimson shadow completely disappeared into the distance. Han Li stroked his chin and shook his head as a slightly forlorn look appeared on his face. It appeared that this man had mastered a movement technique similar to the blood shadow evasion technique. In that case, Han Li was reluctant to expend the time and effort required to chase him down. His top priority was to get to Heavenly Star City as quickly as possible, after all. With that in mind, he turned his attention to the spirit bird, which was still trapped under the silver lotus flower conjured up by the 8th spirit ruler. He flicked a finger through the air, and a golden sword shot forth, instantly slicing the bird in half and putting an end to its life. This was a spirit beast that had been nurtured by the Daoist priest's blood from birth, so there was no way for it to be tamed by anyone else. As such, Han Li naturally wasn't going to let it live. After that, he transformed into a streak of azure light again as he flew directly toward Heavenly Star City. On this occasion, he was flying at full speed, and it only took him around 10 minutes to pass through the Heavenly Windfire Formations restriction. Han Li's body faltered slightly as he broke through the formation, and he paused in his flight as he looked on at Heavenly Star City from afar. There in the distance, the city's gargantuan walls had been enshrouded under a dense barrier of faint blue light. In the air above the light barrier, there were large swaths of red and azure light striking down upon it relentlessly. As the lights of different colors intertwined with one another, earth-shattering thunderclaps rang out incessantly. Upon seeing this, Han Li no longer hesitated any longer as he resumed his journey toward the Heavenly Star City. After just a few flashes, the azure streak of light had reached one of the city gates, but his progress was stalled by that blue light barrier. The Star Palace cultivator behind the light barrier had naturally also caught sight of Han Li, and a loud whistle rang out as a dozen or so Star Palace cultivators of different heights appeared above the city wall, all of whom were appraising Han Li with grave and bewildered expressions. The Starfall Coalition had set up the Heavenly Windfire Formation to prevent people from being able to escape from Heavenly Star City, yet Han Li had gone to all this trouble to break through the restriction and enter from the outside. That was simply inexplicable to them. Even though Han Li was still extremely far away from the city, he could clearly see the expressions on the faces of the Star Palace cultivators through the use of his bright sight spirit eyes. As such, he wasted no time with words, flipping over his palm, instead, to produce the Star Palace Guest Elder Badge he had received from Wen Qing over a century ago. He raised his hand, and the badge slowly flew toward the light barrier, where it remained hovering in mid-air. The sight of this badge created quite a stir among the cultivators above the city gates. Several of the more powerful cultivators were appraising the badge with their brows furrowed tightly in confusion when one of them suddenly seemed to have come to an abrupt realization. An enlightened expression abruptly appeared on his face as he turned to his companions and said something. Expressions of surprise immediately appeared on the faces of the other cultivators, and one of them hurriedly pulled out a flag before waving it several times toward the blue light barrier. The light barrier swayed, and the badge flew into the barrier as a streak of yellow light. Following a few flashes, it emerged on the other side of the barrier as if it had passed through nothing but empty air. Han Li looked on with an aloof expression as he hovered before the light barrier. At this point, all of the cultivators above the city gates had seen the Guest Elder Badge, and expressions of surprise and elation had appeared on all of their faces. One of them pointed at Han Li and said something before pulling a voice transmission talisman out from his storage pouch. He swept a hand through the air, and the talisman transformed into a streak of light as it flew into the city. He then produced a treasure that resembled a formation plate, and pointed his finger at it a few times before asking, "Is that you, Senior Han? Please forgive us for our insolence, As you can see, we're in a time of crisis here, and none of us have ever met you in person before, so we can't allow you into the city. However, I've already sent a voice transmission talisman to our palace master, and she'll arrive here shortly." The man's words completely disregarded the blue light barrier and traveled directly into Han Li's ears. Han Li raised his eyebrows upon hearing this, but he merely nodded in response and waited with his hands clasped behind his back. Not long after that, 3 streaks of light flew out rapidly from within the city before stopping atop the city gates. The trio was comprised of 2 men and a woman, and the woman was standing at the center, indicating that she was the leader of the group. The woman was extremely gorgeous, and her facial features struck Han Li with a sense of familiarity. It was none other than Ling Yuling after reverting back to her female appearance. Accompanying her were a yellow-robed man who appeared to be in his 30s, as well as an elderly man with a head of white hair and a white beard. The 3 of them all had their eyes trained firmly on Han Li. The cultivators guarding the city gates all stood off to the side with respectful expressions, not even daring to breathe too loudly. An elated expression illuminated Ling Yuling's beautiful features as she commanded, "It really is fellow Daoist Han. I thought that he wouldn't be able to get here. Hurry up and let brother Han into the city." "Palace Master, is that a good idea? Is that man really reliable? We'd be in big trouble if he turned out to be a Starfall Coalition cultivator in disguise," the yellow-robed cultivator dissuaded with a hesitant look on his face. Ling Yuling shook her head firmly and replied, "Don't worry, this guest elder badge is completely unique in this world, so there's no mistaking it. Furthermore, with his extraordinary powers, there's no one in the scattered star seas who would be able to take the badge from him." Upon hearing this, the yellow-robed cultivator could only nod in silence. Thus, the cultivators guarding the city gates immediately sprang into action. All of them summoned either a formation flag or a formation plate before tossing them into the air in unison. Lights of various different colors appeared before the formation tools, disappearing into the light barrier in front of the city gates. Chapter 1208, Battle at the Star Palace, 4. The brightness of the blue light barrier immediately increased, following which a circular passageway around 10 feet in diameter appeared. Han Li briefly examined the passageway that had opened up in front of him before flying into it as a streak of azure light appeared on the other side in the blink of an eye. The light barrier shuddered again, and the passageway disappeared. Ling Yuling turned to Han Li with an elated smile on her face as she said, "Fellow Daoist Han, you're finally here. I made a promise to your parents, so I certainly couldn't ignore your request for help in your time of need," Han Li replied with a smile. "I'm extremely grateful for your assistance, Brother Han. With you here, there's no need for us to fear those Starfall Coalition clowns. This is not the place to talk. Come with me to the sacred mountain, fellow Daoist Han. Elder son, inform all of the elders who aren't currently on duty to gather at the sacred palace. I have important matters to discuss with them." Ling Yuling extended an invitation to Han Li before issuing some instructions to the yellow-robed cultivator beside her. "Yes, Palace Master." The yellow-robed cultivator was an early-nascent soul cultivator, and as soon as Han Li had passed through the light barrier, he had tried to ascertain Han Li's cultivation base using his spiritual sense. What he discovered was that Han Li's cultivation base was completely unfathomable to him, and a hint of awe and veneration intermingled with shock appeared on his face. After hearing Ling Yuling's orders, he immediately cupped his fist in a salute before pulling out a stack of voice transmission talisman to inform the Star Palace elders of the Palace Master's instructions. At this moment, Han Li turned toward the white-haired elderly man and said, "Long time no see, fellow Daoist Jiao, you're looking quite well. Not only that, but your cultivation base has also improved drastically. I must congratulate you." The elderly man was none other than the very same Elder Jiao who had approached Han Li with that dual cultivation proposal on Silver Shark Island. It had been more than a century since Han Li had last seen him, and he had reached the mid-nascent soul stage as well, just as Ling Yuling had. However, a wry smile appeared on Elder Jiao's face upon hearing this, indicating that there were some hidden circumstances involved behind his breakthrough. I wouldn't have been able to take this step by myself. It's all thanks to the 2 former palace masters that I was able to take another strike in my cultivation base.
Oh, I see.
A contemplative look appeared on Han Li's face after hearing this. So you and Elder Jiao are old acquaintances as well. I'm glad to see that. Let's head to the sacred palace first, and we'll continue our conversation there, Ling Yuling suggested with a smile. Han Li naturally had no objections to this, and he nodded in response. Thus, the group rose into the air and flew toward the sacred mountain at the center of Heavenly Star City. Under the guidance of Ling Yuling and the others, Han Li flew directly toward the highest level of the sacred mountain before descending in front of what appeared to be a very nondescript blue stone palace. Han Li appraised the stone palace with a hint of surprise on his face. Do you find our sacred palace to be too mundane, Brother Han? Ling Yuling turned to Han Li with a dainty smile. It's indeed not what I was expecting. Han Li made no effort to deny this. It does indeed look quite ordinary, but all of our past palace masters have cultivated here before, so it was preserved and is regarded as one of the most important places in our star palace. We normally wouldn't let outsiders set foot into this palace, but you came from afar to help us in our time of need, so you're naturally exempt from this rule, Brother Han, Ling Yuling explained with a smile. The palace itself does look quite mundane, but there's a remarkable abundance of spiritual qi in the surrounding area, so it's an exceptional place to cultivate in. I doubt there would be many islands on the inner star seas that could provide a cultivation environment comparable to this one. Han Li nodded in response. Ling Yuling's smile widened upon hearing this, and she immediately led Han Li toward the gates of the stone palace. The dozen or so star palace disciples guarding the gate hurriedly extended respectful bows toward their group, and all of them wore rather curious expressions at the sight of Han Li. Ling Yuling naturally wasn't going to waste time providing an explanation to these guards as she led Han Li into the palace. Their group filed into a short corridor before arriving in an antiquated hall, where all of them took a seat. Brother Han, you must have learned about our star palace's situation on your way here, right? Ling Yuling cut straight to the point. Of course. It appears that the star palace is in a rather perilous situation, Han Li replied calmly. Then I suppose you're also aware of the fact that our star palace had initially gained the upper hand, and we've only been plunged into this situation because that Wan Qianming suddenly reached the late nascent soul stage. Only after he became a great cultivator did the Starfall Coalition manage to turn the tables, so he is the key in this battle. Brother Han, as long as you can hold off that man, I'm confident that our star palace would be able to destroy the Starfall Coalition again. A cold look appeared in Ling Yuling's eyes as she spoke. So you want me to fight that sect master Wan? Han Li asked. Ling Yuling faltered slightly, and a hesitant look appeared on her face as she asked, Are you unhappy with that arrangement, Brother Han? Han Li raised an eyebrow, and replied, It's not that, I just think there seems to be a misunderstanding here, Fairy Ling. A misunderstanding? Could it be that you're not here to help me, Brother Han? Ling Yuling's expression changed slightly upon hearing this. Of course I'm here to help you, it's just that. Han Li was just about to explain when his words came to a halt, and he suddenly turned toward the entrance of the hall. Ling Yuling naturally also cast her gaze toward the same direction. Moments later, 3 cultivators strode into palace, one of which was a mid-nascent soul cultivator, while the other 2 were at the early nascent soul stage. The mid-nascent soul cultivator was a purple-robed man with a pockmarked face. After entering the hall, he refrained from extending a salute toward Ling Yuling, and instead turned toward Han Li with an unfriendly expression, giving off a rather uncouth and antagonistic demeanor. However, his pupils immediately contracted as he swept his spiritual sense toward Han Li, and his expression became quite strained. At this moment, Ling Yuling smiled, and said, Elder Ma, I didn't think you'd get here so quickly. Have a seat. When all of the other elders get here as well, I'll introduce to everyone an esteemed guest of our star palace. Indeed, I can sense that this fellow Daoist possesses an unfathomable cultivation base, so a warm welcome is very much necessary. The purple-robed man quickly composed himself before giving Han Li a forced smile and taking a seat. After assessing Han Li's cultivation base, he was clearly a lot more subdued than he was just a second ago. The other 2 star palace elders were naturally unable to identify Han Li's cultivation base, but the purple-robed man's reaction told them everything they needed to know. As such, They exchanged an astonished glance with one another before cupping their fists in a salute toward Ling Yuling and also taking a seat. However, in response to this, Ling Yuling merely tucked a few stray strands of hair behind her ear as a cold light flashed through her eyes. Han Li was observing all of these minor details, and a hint of a smile appeared on her face. It was quite clear that this elder Ma wasn't content to serve this new master of the Star Palace, and Ling Yuling was using him to intimidate these elders and keep them in check. Han Li was feeling both rather amused and a little speechless. However, Ling Yuling was an old acquaintance of his, so he didn't take this to heart. After all, what she was doing wasn't causing harm to him in any way. Following the arrival of Elder Ma's trio, the rest of the Star Palace elders also began to arrive at the Sacred Palace one after the other. All of them were immediately given quite a surprise by the sight of the unfamiliar great cultivator present among their ranks. Even though none of these nascent soul stage elders could ascertain Han Li's true cultivation base, all of them turned to Elder Ma as a litmus test for Han Li's power, and all of them were quite stunned by what they saw. Before long, over 20 Star Palace elders had gathered in the hall. Aside from 3 mid-nascent soul cultivators, Elder Zhao, Elder Ma, and Ling Yuling, all of the rest were at the early nascent soul stage. Ling Yuling slowly rose to her feet and pointed at Han Li with a smile as she announced, "Seeing as everyone's here, let me introduce to you all an esteemed guest. This is the guest elder appointed by the former palace masters, Han Li." All of the elders present had naturally heard of Han Li before, and Ling Yuling's announcement created quite a stir among them, to the extent that one of them couldn't help but exclaim, "Han Li!" Han Li turned toward the Star Palace elder who had spoken to find that it was a benevolent-looking white-robed elderly man. Han Li's eyes narrowed as a contemplative look appeared in his eyes. All of a sudden, a thought seemed to have occurred to him as his expression darkened. "It appears that we've met in the Heaven Void Hall before. I recall that there were 2 fellow Taoists responsible for opening the Heaven Void Hall back then. May I ask where he is?" Han Li's voice had become rather cold and unforgiving. Meanwhile, the white-robed elder's face had turned deathly pale. This man was none other than the Star Palace enforcement elder who had almost stabbed Han Li through the heart in the Heaven Void Hall. Back when he had just entered the hall, he had found Han Li to be rather familiar, but he failed to immediately identify him. However, Ling Yuling's introduction made him recall the memories of the events that had taken place in the Heaven Void Hall, and he naturally managed to identify Han Li. Ling Yuling could naturally glean the cold look in Han Li's eyes, and her heart sank in response, but she could only muster up her courage and ask, "Do you recognize Elder Shimon, Brother Han?" A series of emotions quickly flashed through Han Li's eyes, and he seemed to have arrived at some sort of decision as he reverted back to his normal calm expression, and replied, "I'm not very familiar with him. It's just that fellow Daoist Shimon had caused some trouble for me back when I hadn't reached the nascent soul stage." Ling Yuling was quite relieved that Han Li was making light of the matter, and she hurriedly changed the subject as she said, "I see. If Elder Shimon caused you any offense in the past, I hope you may forgive him, Brother Han. Let's get back to our discussion about Wan Qianming, shall we? After all, the top priority for our Star Palace is to eradicate the Starfall Coalition." The white-robed elder was also slightly relieved after hearing Han Li's words, but he was still unable to completely quell the fear in his heart. "I don't know what the late sages told you, fellow Daoist Ling, but the promise I made to them was that I would only step in if and when your life is under direct threat, and I'll do everything in my power to save you. I didn't promise them that I would fight for the Star Palace against a cultivator of the same cultivation base as mine to the death," Han Li said in a slow voice. His words were met with complete silence. Chapter 1209, Battle at the Star Palace, 5. "If the Star Palace falls, do you think I can remain safe, fellow Daoist Han? Besides, I'm not asking you to fight Wan Qianming to the death. I'm simply asking you to hold him off while I lead the Star Palace in a retaliation against the Starfall Coalition. Surely that's within your capabilities, Brother Han," Ling Yuling said in a slow voice as her brows furrowed. "That is indeed something I'm capable of doing. However, Wan Qianming is a great cultivator as well, and I won't be able to predict whether he'll try to engage me in a battle to the death. If you agree that I can flee the battle should he unleash some type of powerful trump card, I can consider stepping in on this occasion. Then again, the welfare of the Star Palace and your safety are two completely different matters. Even if the Star Palace ceases to exist, I'm confident in my ability to keep you alive, and that'll be enough to fulfill the promise I made to the former palace leaders. Otherwise, it's really not worth it for me to take this risk just for the benefits that the sages offered me in return. Han Li's calm reply highlighted the crux of the matter. Ling Yuling's expression changed slightly upon hearing this. Meanwhile, Elder Zhao had read between the lines, and his brows furrowed as he stroked his beard. Fellow Daoist Han, from what you're saying, it sounds like you won't necessarily refuse to help us, but we have to pay a sufficient price in exchange for your assistance, right? Of course. Nothing in this world comes without a price. If your Star Palace offers me sufficiently tempting remuneration, I can consider taking a risk, Han Li admitted with a faint smile. What do you want from our Star Palace, fellow Daoist Han? It was Elder Ma who had spoken on this occasion. It's not a matter of what I want. Instead, it's a matter of what your Star Palace is planning to offer to me, Han Li replied expressionlessly. Different expressions appeared on the faces of the Star Palace elders, and some of them were beginning to converse through voice transmission. In reality, none of them were overly surprised by Han Li's rejection. If someone were to ask them to fight a cultivator of the same cultivation base to the death for no reward, they certainly wouldn't agree to do so, either. Furthermore, this was going to be a clash between two great cultivators, beings who stood at the pinnacle of the human world, so the risks involved would undoubtedly be more severe than in a battle between cultivators of a lesser caliber. However, it wouldn't be an easy task to offer a reward that could tempt Han Li. After all, a great cultivator like him would most likely simply scoff at normal treasures, materials, and cultivation arts. Ling Yuling sat in the main seat and looked on with a contemplative expression as the elders conversed among themselves. After a while, she broke the silence and said, "Your proposal is quite reasonable, Brother Han. However, ordinary items clearly won't be able to catch your eye, so I'm willing to offer the cultivation art of our Star Palace's Divine Essence Fused Light and our Divine Essence Fused Mountain as a reward. Will that be satisfactory to you, fellow Daoist Han?" The Divine Essence Fused Light is an extremely powerful cultivation art, and only a man of Brother Han's extraordinary talent deserves to cultivate it. The reward that Ling Yuling was offering was none other than Han Li's objective for this trip, and this turn of events came as quite a surprise to Han Li. His expression faltered slightly before he appraised Ling Yuling through narrowed eyes and fell into deep thought. All of the other Star Palace elders were startled to hear this, but after exchanging glances with one another, none of them stated any objections. The Divine Essence Fused Light was indeed an extremely powerful cultivation art that had been used by the late Heavenly Star Sages. However, it was also quite renowned to be very difficult to cultivate, and its disadvantages were also quite apparent. As such, for normal nascent soul cultivators, this was certainly a tempting prospect, but it wasn't actually one that held much practical value. As such, no one had any objections to Ling Yuling's proposal. Instead, they were all worried about whether Han Li would actually agree to this deal. Much to their surprise, Han Li only contemplated the offer for a short while before nodding with a meaningful expression. It seems that Fairy Ling already knew what I wanted. I'm not a greedy person, so I won't ask for any more than that. I'm happy to accept this offer. When the time comes, I'll help your Star Palace hold off WN Tianming. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to kill him, but I'll make sure that he won't be able to attack any of you. All right, our Star Palace has full trust in you, Brother Han. I'll get someone to give you the cultivation art for the Divine Essence Fused Light, and once this battle concludes, I'll present the Divine Essence Fused Mountain to you. A smile had reappeared on Ling Yuling's beautiful features. Seeing as he had achieved his objective, Han Li didn't wish to stay here any longer, and he rose to his feet as he said, "In that case, I'll be awaiting further instructions from you on how to proceed, fellow Daoist Ling. It's been a rather tiring journey for me, so I'm going to take my leave and have some rest." Ling Yuling immediately nodded as she turned to Elder Zhao with an amicable expression, and instructed, "Of course. Elder Zhao, organize a silent cultivation chamber for fellow Daoist Han so he can rest and recuperate. Fellow Daoist Han is an esteemed guest of ours, so I'll have to trouble you to look after him, Elder Zhao." Elder Zhao nodded and extended a bow toward Ling Yuling before leading Han Li out of the hall. Han Li nodded toward Ling Yuling, but didn't immediately follow Elder Zhao out of the room. Instead, he suddenly turned his gaze to Elder Zement, upon which a faint blue light shimmered through his eyes, and only then did he make his way out of the hall in an unhurried manner. A chill ran down Elder Shimon's spine at the sight of Han Li's cold gaze, and at the same time, he felt a sharp pain in his spiritual sense, which almost made him jump up from his seat. However, after Han Li turned and left, the sharp pain in his spiritual sense completely disappeared, as if it had just been a figment of his imagination. Elder Shimon was naturally very alarmed, and he hurriedly conducted a thorough examination of his own body with his spiritual sense, only to find that nothing was amiss. Elder Shimon was greatly relieved after making that discovery. It appeared that he had been excessively paranoid. After all, they were situated in the Star Palace right now, and even a great cultivator wouldn't dare to attack him. However, at the same time, he had made up his mind. As soon as this conference was over, he was going to find an obscure location to hide in and only emerge when the battle began. During this time, he was going to take extra care not to bump into Han Li in order to ensure his own safety. After all, that attack he had unleashed in the Heaven Void Hall all those years ago had almost taken Han Li's life, and now that Han Li was far more powerful than he was, it was very unlikely that he would simply be willing to let bygones be bygones. If he had known that Han Li would become so powerful, he would have either refrained from attacking him or made absolute sure that he was dead. Elder Shimon's heart was filled with remorse as he heaved an internal sigh. As soon as Han Li and Elder Zhao had left, Elder Ma turned to Ling Yuling with a skeptical expression, and asked, "Palace Master, is that Han Li really going to be able to hold off WN Qianming? And are we sure that he can be trusted? What if this man is actually allied with the Starfall Coalition, and he lends his assistance to them during the battle instead? If that happens, we'll be completely lost. Wouldn't it be safer to continue to guard Heavenly Star City through the use of our restriction?" "Don't worry, Elder Ma. I've known fellow Daoist Han even before he made the deal with my late parents. Even though we're not close friends, I know that he has a lot of bad blood with the Starfall Coalition due to the incidents surrounding the Heaven Void Cauldron many years ago, so there's no way that he would pledge his allegiance to them. As for whether he can actually hold off WAN Qianming, I'm confident in his ability to do so. After all, fellow Daoist Han reached the late nascent soul stage even earlier than WN Qianming did, and he also has the Heaven Void Cauldron to assist him, so he should be the more powerful of the two great cultivators no matter how we look at it. Besides, do any of you have any better ideas? The restriction around our Heavenly Star City is indeed quite powerful, but it definitely won't be able to last for too long under the constant bombardment from the Heavenly Windfire formation. We can't just take a passive approach and hope for the best. A decisive result has to be reached, and either the Starfall Coalition has to fall or our Star Palace will cease to exist," Ling Yuling replied in a firm voice. Elder Ma contemplated the situation for a while but was unable to provide any alternative tactics, so he could only reluctantly concede. "If that's the case, then it seems we can only rely on that man." Elder Ma was the most disobedient and uncouth Star Palace elder by far, so Ling Yuling was quite pleased that even he had no objections to her proposed course of action. "As such," she continued, "let's discuss how we're going to attack the Starfall Coalition, and also how we're going to break their Heavenly Windfire formation." Within a peaceful silent cultivation chamber, Han Li sat with his knees crossed and his eyes closed as he made a strange hand seal. After a long while, he suddenly stirred as he slowly opened his eyes. "Are you going to find that Elder Shimon now?" The Endless Sky Beast's tender voice sounded beside his ears. "You know what I'm up to." Han Li remained expressionless, but his voice had become more grim. "I don't know exactly what secret technique you used, but you clearly used your spiritual sense to place a spiritual marker on that man before you left the hall. Even though that secret technique was nothing special, the power of your spiritual sense ensures that none of the cultivators in the palace would have been able to detect what you were doing. I'm assuming you didn't place the spiritual marker on that man so you could invite him out for a meal, right?" The demon beast chuckled. "Seeing as you already know everything, then there's nothing for me to deny. That man almost took my life in the Heaven Void Hall. I'm not a petty person, but I can't just forgive a man who tried to kill me. It would have been difficult for me to kill him in that stone palace, but he's left the palace now, so it's time for me to strike," Han Li admitted with a cold smile. He patted the storage pouch hanging from his waist and silver light flashed as the humanoid puppet soundlessly appeared. It then hovered toward a nearby wall before disappearing in a flash. After that, Han Li rose to his feet and pushed open the door of the silent cultivation chamber before making his way outside. After passing through a short corridor, Han Li arrived in a large hall. Elder Zhao was seated and sipping on some tea, and he was rather surprised to Han Li emerge from the chamber. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face as he said, "Elder Zhao, you're using a wood attribute cultivation art as well, right? If you don't mind, would you be willing to discuss cultivation experiences and insights with me?" Half a day later, a certain soul lamp in a restricted area of the Star Palace was suddenly snuffed out. The Star Palace disciple looking after the lamps was given a massive fright, and he hurriedly reported this matter to the higher-ups of the sect. The entire Star Palace plunged into turmoil, and not long after that, several Star Palace elders broke into a secret chamber in Elder Shimon's cave abode. Several hours ago, there were disciples who had personally witnessed Elder Shimon entering that secret chamber. However, the chamber was now completely empty. Even if he had actually passed away, as the dimming of the soul lamp suggested, there was no body to be found.